Rain began falling by the time Changho led Amara out of the ruined building. The storm cooled the heat lingering over the compound, washing across shattered concrete and streaks of blood, while wolves moved through the aftermath of the battle beneath harsh floodlights. The fighting had stopped, but the damage remained everywhere she looked. Injured pack members sat against walls and overturned vehicles, while others carried supplies between them. Several restrained rogues knelt near the eastern barricade beneath heavy guard, their attention lowering immediately whenever Changho passed nearby. Amara felt his hand resting firmly against the small of her back as he guided her carefully through the compound. The contact never left her. Even exhausted and injured, Changho stayed close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body beside hers with every step. And after everything that happened tonight, the steady pressure of his hand grounded her more than she wanted to admit. The wolves looked at her differently now. Amara noticed it almost immediately. Before the kidnapping, most of the pack had treated her carefully because she was under Changho's protection. Some had been polite. Others had been cautious. A few openly watched her with curiosity because she was human. Tonight had changed something. Now, when the wolves looked at her, Amara felt recognition in their attention. Several lowered their heads respectfully as she passed. Others watched her with quiet emotion she still didn't fully know how to process. It unsettled her far more than hostility would have. A younger wolf sitting near a damaged truck pushed himself upright the moment Changho approached. Blood soaked through the bandage wrapped around his shoulder, and pain tightened his expression when he straightened fully, but he still lowered his head respectfully toward Changho before his eyes shifted to Amara. Then he repeated the gesture toward her. Amara slowed immediately. The wolf looked embarrassed once he realized she noticed. "You fought well tonight, Luna," he said quietly. The title hit her hard enough that she nearly stopped walking altogether. Changho's hand tightened slightly against her back. The wolf swallowed once before continuing. "Thank you for calling him." Amara frowned softly. "Calling him?" The wolf nodded. "We felt you through the bond." A strange warmth spread through her chest at the sincerity in his voice. Not because she fully understood what he meant yet, because she realized he genuinely believed she had helped save them. Changho guided her forward again before the wolf could continue speaking, but the moment stayed with her as they crossed deeper into the compound. More wolves acknowledged her now that she was paying attention. Several stepped aside immediately when she approached. Others looked visibly relieved when they saw her standing beside Changho alive. One older wolf near the medical tents pressed his fist quietly against his chest before lowering his head toward her. Each interaction made the bond pulse faintly beneath her skin. The sensation no longer frightened her. If anything, it felt strangely familiar. "They really felt all of that?" she asked quietly. Changho glanced down at her as rain slid along the side of his face. "They felt enough to know you reached me." Amara looked at him carefully. He looked exhausted. Blood still marked his skin and clothing. The deep wounds across his shoulder and ribs had already started healing, but she could still see evidence of the brutality he endured to reach her. And despite the exhaustion weighing on him, Changho had not once loosened his hold on her since they left the building. The realization tightened something painfully warm inside her chest. Near the center of the compound, Taejin stood speaking with several wolves beside an overturned transport vehicle, while Sable directed others carrying the wounded toward a safer section of the compound. Both looked up the second Changho and Amara approached. Relief crossed Taejin's face openly enough that Amara almost smiled. "You're still standing," he said. "Barely," Amara admitted with a tired laugh. Sable's sharp eyes immediately scanned the bruises around Amara's wrists before shifting toward Changho's injuries. "You look worse," she told him bluntly. Changho looked entirely unimpressed by the observation. "I've had better nights." That finally earned a small smile from Sable. For several seconds, the four of them stood quietly beneath the rain while wolves moved around them rebuilding barricades and helping the injured. Amara looked around the compound slowly. At the battered walls. At the exhausted wolves still working despite their injuries. At Taejin and Sable standing beside Changho without hesitation. At the wolves who continued glancing toward her with growing recognition every time the bond stirred. And then she looked at Changho. At the man who crossed rogue territory for her without hesitation. The man who nearly tore himself apart trying to find her. The man whose hands still rested protectively against her back as though letting go was no longer an option. For the first time since arriving in Korea, the feeling settling into Amara's chest went beyond attraction or temporary comfort. Standing in the middle of the battered compound beside Changho and his pack, she realized this place had started feeling like home. The realization hit her so suddenly that she spoke before she could second-guess herself. "I don't want to leave." Changho went completely still beside her. The bond tightened sharply between them, and when Amara looked up at him again, the emotion crossing his face made her chest ache all over again. Han stepped into view first, blood covering one side of his face and chest while Jisoo followed close behind him, wiping blood from her blade. Several other wolves appeared farther back near the compound entrance. Every eye settled on Changho and Amara. No one interrupted. No one spoke. The entire pack felt the shift that had happened tonight. Amara noticed it too. Her fingers tightened slightly against Changho's shirt as she glanced toward the gathered wolves. "They're watching." Changho looked at his pack briefly before returning his attention to her. "Let them." Something warm moved through the bond the moment he said it. Not embarrassment. Not fear. Pride. The feeling hit Changho hard enough that his chest tightened again. Because Amara wasn't shrinking beneath the attention anymore. She wasn't trying to disappear from what she meant to him. She was standing beside him openly. And the entire pack could feel it. Changho lifted his hand slowly and brushed his fingers against the fading mark at her neck. The moment he touched it, the bond pulsed warmly between them. Amara inhaled softly. Her eyes lifted back to his instantly. "You marked me," she said quietly, as though she was still fully processing it herself. Changho's expression darkened slightly with memory. The night they were together rushed through him immediately. Her hands on him, the sound of her voice breaking beneath his mouth, the overwhelming instinct that drove him to bite her without fully understanding what he was doing. "I know," he said. Amara stared at him for another long moment before a small, emotional laugh escaped her. "I thought it was a hickey." For the first time all night, Changho smiled fully. The sight of it nearly stole her breath. Blood-covered, exhausted, bruised, and standing in the middle of a destroyed compound, but ass-naked, he still somehow looked unfairly beautiful when he smiled at her like that. "You have no idea how hard it was not to lose my mind when you said that," he admitted. Amara laughed again softly, and the sound alone made something deep in Changho finally unclench. Alive. She was alive. Still laughing. Still touching him. Still his. The bond swelled warmly between them as Changho rested his forehead against hers. Around them, the compound remained quiet. The pack watched silently. And one by one, wolves throughout the ruined battlefield lowered their heads toward Amara. Not out of fear. Out of recognition. Changho felt the exact moment Amara realized what was happening. Her breathing caught softly. His hand tightened around hers. And when she looked back at him, uncertainty flickered across her face for the first time since he found her. "What are they doing?" Changho held her gaze steadily. "They're acknowledging their Luna." The emotion that crossed Amara's face after that nearly destroyed him. Because this time, she didn't deny it. Changho barely remembered the walk back to his room. He remembered Amara's hand in his. He remembered wolves stepping aside the second they saw them coming. He remembered Han saying something behind him near the staircase about securing the remaining rogues before sunrise. But none of it stayed in his head for longer than a few seconds. Because every part of him was still locked onto one overwhelming truth. Amara was alive. The second the bedroom door shut behind them, the last thread of control holding Changho together finally snapped. He turned toward her so quickly that Amara barely had time to look up before his hands were on her face and his mouth crashed against hers. The kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It carried too many hours of fear inside it for that. Changho kissed her like he was still trying to convince himself she was real, his hands sliding into her hair as he backed her toward the door hard enough that her breath caught against his mouth. Amara kissed him back instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The bond surged violently between them the moment she wrapped her arms around his neck, and the sound that escaped Changho's chest was rough enough to make her pulse jump. He needed this. Needed her warmth. Needed her heartbeat. Needed the taste of her mouth after spending hours imagining the worst possible ending. "Changho," she whispered breathlessly when he finally pulled back far enough for air. His forehead dropped against hers immediately. His breathing sounded uneven now. Not from exhaustion. From emotional overload, he was no longer trying to hide. "You scared the hell out of me," he admitted quietly. Amara's chest tightened. She felt the truth of those words through the bond before she even fully processed them herself. Changho had been terrified. Not angry first. Not violent first. Terrified. Her hand slid slowly down his chest, and the second her fingers brushed one of the deep wounds across his ribs, Changho hissed softly through his teeth. Amara's eyes widened immediately. You're hurt worse than you admitted. Changho gave a tired exhale that almost sounded like a laugh. I've had worse. That's not comforting. A faint smile pulled briefly at the corner of his mouth before disappearing, just as quickly. Because now that they were alone, Amara could finally see what the rest of the pack probably missed. Changho looked exhausted down to the bone. The emotional strain of the broken bond had done damage no physical fight ever could. Amara lifted her hand carefully toward his face again. The second her fingers touched his jaw, the bond opened warmly between them. Changho closed his eyes. And that, more than the blood, more than the wounds, more than the violence she witnessed tonight, shook Amara the most. This man trusted her completely now. You really thought I was dead, she whispered softly. Changho opened his eyes again. The emotion in them nearly shattered her. When I couldn't feel you anymore. He swallowed once. I didn't know how to survive that. The honesty in his voice hit her so hard she stopped breathing for a second. Because Changho wasn't performing strength for her anymore. He wasn't hiding behind control. He was letting her see the damage. Amara stepped closer until there wasn't space left between them. You found me, she whispered. Changho stared at her for several long seconds before his hands slid slowly down her waist like he needed the physical reassurance all over again. Then his mouth found hers a second time. This kiss changed immediately. The desperation was still there, but now something deeper moved beneath it. Relief. Need. Devotion. Changho kissed her slowly this time, like he was finally allowing himself to feel everything he had shoved down while hunting for her. Amara melted against him almost instantly. The bond wrapped around both of them so tightly now that separating where her emotions ended and his began was becoming impossible. Changho's hands slid beneath the edge of her ruined shirt, his palms pressing carefully against her waist before moving higher along bare skin. Amara shivered hard beneath the touch. Not because his hands were rough. Because every touch carried emotion through the bond now. She could feel how badly he needed closeness. How deeply he craved reassurance that she was standing here alive in his arms. And underneath all of it, she felt how much restraint he was using not to completely lose himself against her. Her fingers slid into his hair gently. You can breathe now, she whispered against his mouth. Changho let out a shaky exhale that almost broke her heart. Then he buried his face against her neck and held her so tightly she could feel the slight tremor moving through his arms. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The room stayed quiet except for rain tapping softly against the windows and the uneven sound of Changho finally allowing himself to collapse emotionally where only she could see it. Amara closed her eyes and held him back just as tightly. And for the first time since the kidnapping began, the bond between them felt completely whole again.
Amara's POV. Amara woke slowly to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. For several quiet seconds, she stayed still beneath the blankets with Changho's arm wrapped securely around her waist and the steady rise and fall of his breathing warming the back of her neck. The exhaustion from the battle still lingered in her body. But something about the morning felt different almost immediately. Sharper. More vivid. At first, she assumed adrenaline simply hadn't fully left her system yet. Then she heard footsteps downstairs. Amara's eyes opened instantly. The sound was so clear that she turned toward the bedroom door, before she fully realized how impossible it should have been. The footsteps weren't outside the room. They weren't even on the same floor. They were several levels below them inside the compound. And somehow, she could hear them as clearly as if the wolves were standing outside the bedroom. Voices followed a second later. 2 wolves speaking quietly near the lower hallway. One sounded irritated. The other sounded exhausted. They were discussing repairs to the eastern barricade, and whether the remaining rogues would attempt another attack before sunrise. Amara pushed herself up slowly onto one elbow, confusion tightening across her face. The movement woke Changho immediately. His eyes opened without hesitation, alertness replacing sleep so quickly it almost startled her. Then he saw her expression. What is it? Amara hesitated before answering. I can hear them. Changho frowned slightly. Hear who? The wolves downstairs. Silence settled between them. Then Changho sat up fully. Amara felt the bond shift the second his attention sharpened completely onto her. The concern moving through him brushed against her emotions before she even saw it fully cross his face. I shouldn't be able to hear that, she said quietly. No, Changho admitted. You shouldn't. The answer should have frightened her. Instead, Curiosity started pushing harder against the confusion because the sounds weren't fading. If anything, they were becoming easier to separate the more she focused. Another sound reached her attention. Rain sliding through the gutters outside. Several wolves moving near the western side of the compound. A truck engine somewhere farther away. Amara turned instinctively toward the windows, her breathing slowing as the world around her seemed to sharpen in layers. What the hell is happening to me? Changho watched her carefully for several seconds before his eyes moved briefly toward the fading bite mark near her neck. The mark accelerated the bond, he said finally. Amara looked back at him immediately. Accelerated what exactly? Changho shifted slightly closer toward her before answering. Most mates feel emotional connection first. Instinct. Attraction. Awareness through the bond. His gaze held hers steadily. This is progressing faster. Amara touched the mark at her neck unconsciously. The skin there still felt warm beneath her fingertips, almost like a second pulse connected directly to him. I thought becoming Luna was symbolic, she admitted quietly. Changho gave a faint shake of his head. For some wolves, parts of it are. His eyes lowered briefly toward the mark again. But the bond changes people, especially once a mating mark is involved. Amara stared at him for a second. You say that like you expected this. I expected changes, he corrected. I didn't expect them this quickly. That definitely did not make her feel calmer. Another sound interrupted her thoughts. A heartbeat. Strong. Steady. Close enough that she instinctively turned toward Changho before realizing what she was hearing. Her eyes widened immediately. That's you. Changho blinked once. What? I can hear your heartbeat. The second the words left her mouth, Changho went completely still. Amara heard the rhythm change almost immediately. Faster now. Oh my God. Changho looked somewhere between fascinated and concerned. What else can you hear? Amara focused carefully again. The compound slowly unfolded around her through sound and instinct in ways she still didn't fully understand. Rain against the roof. Wolves moving below them. Voices farther down the hallway. The low hum of generators outside. And then something else reached her. Not sound this time. Presence. Recognition. Taejin. Sable. The realization hit her so suddenly that she looked back at Changho in shock. I can feel them. Changho's expression changed instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. The pack bond, he said quietly. Amara stared at him. That's real. A faint smile touched his mouth despite the seriousness of the conversation. For us. Very. The way he said us sent warmth through her chest again. Amara lowered her eyes slowly toward her hands, trying to process everything happening inside her body. Only a few months ago she had been a human woman trying to survive graduate school, while avoiding pack politics she barely understood. Now she could hear wolves several floors below her. She could feel members of Changho's pack through a bond tied directly into her emotions. And despite how overwhelming the changes should have felt, nothing inside her believed they were wrong. Changho reached for her hand carefully. The second his fingers intertwined with hers, the tension inside her eased slightly beneath the warmth of the bond. You're not alone in this, he said quietly. Amara looked back up at him. The sincerity in his eyes steadied her more than the reassurance itself. And for the first time since waking up, fear stopped leading the conversation inside her head. Baehoon's POV. Pain followed Baehoon everywhere now. It sat in his ribs when he breathed. It burned through his chest every time he moved too quickly. Even the healing wounds Kazryn left behind felt less humiliating than the memories attached to them. He had lost. There was no twisting it into strategy anymore. No pride left to hide behind. Kazryn beat him in front of his wolves, reclaimed his mate, and walked out of the compound with his pack at his back, while Baehoon barely escaped with the few rogues still willing to follow him. And somehow, that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Amara. Baehoon stood near the window of the abandoned safe house, staring out into the rain-covered forest while voices carried faintly from the room downstairs. The remaining rogues had spent most of the morning arguing. Not about revenge. About leaving. Several already had. Others planned to disappear before nightfall. And none of them were trying very hard to hide it anymore. A knock sounded lightly at the door before one of the older rogues stepped inside. We got word from the southern packs, the wolf said carefully. Baehoon didn't turn around. And the rogue hesitated briefly before answering. They won't support another attack. That didn't surprise him. What reason did they give? The wolf let out a quiet breath. They said no one wants war with Alpha Changho after what happened at the compound. The title alone tightened Baehoon's jaw. Not Kazryn. Not the wolf. Changho. Because somehow the man had become even more dangerous than the Alpha. The rogue shifted uncomfortably near the doorway before continuing. They're saying the bond changed him. Baehoon gave a bitter laugh under his breath. They're right. Silence settled heavily between them after that. The truth was impossible to deny now. Changho had become untouchable the second Amara chose him publicly. The packs felt it. The wolves witnessed it. Even rogues understood the shift that happened the moment she stood beside him instead of behind him. No one wanted to challenge a fully bonded alpha protecting his Luna. Not anymore. Baehoon finally turned away from the window and crossed slowly toward the table near the center of the room. Maps still covered the surface from the original war plans, but now they looked pointless. Outdated. Dead. What about the Western Alliance? He asked quietly. The rogue shook his head immediately. Gone. And the Northern rogues? They scattered after the battle. Baehoon lowered himself carefully into the chair beside the table, pain pulling sharply through his ribs. For several seconds, he stared silently at the maps spread beneath his hands. Months of planning. Years of resentment. All of it collapsed in one night. Not because Changho killed him. Because Changho left him alive. That part still ate at him. Kazryn could have finished him in that room. Baehoon knew it. The entire compound knew it. But Changho walked away with Amara instead. And somehow that mercy felt worse than death. The rogue studied him cautiously. What do we do now? Baehoon looked down at the map beneath his hand before answering. Nothing. The wolf frowned slightly. Nothing. There's nowhere left to fight. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but they were true. No pack would stand beside him now. No rogue group wanted to risk retaliation after what Kazryn did at the compound. And after Amara's awakening spread through the territories, most wolves would avoid Changho's territory entirely rather than provoke another conflict. The balance had shifted too far. Baehoon leaned back slowly in the chair and closed his eyes briefly. Against his will, his mind replayed the image of Amara standing beside Changho beneath the rain after the battle. Alive. Chosen. Looking at Changho like she finally understood exactly who he was to her. That image followed him worse than the wounds did. Because deep down, Baehoon knew something he would never admit out loud. He had already lost Amara long before the kidnapping. The compound only forced him to watch it happen completely. The rogue remained quiet near the doorway. After several long seconds, Baehoon finally opened his eyes again. Pull everyone back, he said quietly. Whatever's left of this pack survives by staying out of Changho's territory. The rogue nodded once. Relief crossed his face so quickly Baehoon almost laughed. Even his own wolves feared another war now. Once the rogue left the room, silence settled heavily through the safe house again. Rain continued falling outside while Baehoon stared at the ruined plans spread across the table. The revenge still sat inside him. He doubted it would ever fully disappear. But revenge without power was just bitterness. And bitterness wasn't enough to survive a war against Changho anymore. Especially not now that Amara stood beside him. Amara did not expect the pack council room to feel intimidating. After surviving a kidnapping, a rogue compound, and watching Changho nearly kill a man for touching her, she assumed a meeting would be the least stressful part of her week. She was wrong. The room fell quiet the second she walked in beside Changho. A long table stretched through the center of the space beneath warm overhead lighting, with several older wolves already seated along both sides. Han stood near the far wall speaking quietly with Sable when they entered, while a few unfamiliar wolves immediately straightened in their seats once Changho approached. Amara felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward her. Not hostile. Evaluating. Curious. Cautious. The attention tightened her shoulders instantly. Changho noticed. His hand brushed lightly against the small of her back as he guided her farther into the room. A quiet reminder that she wasn't walking into this alone. Sit beside me, he said calmly. The words weren't harsh, but the room reacted to them anyway. Amara noticed it immediately. Several wolves exchanged brief looks. One older man near the end of the table leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her with open concern before his attention shifted toward Changho. You're placing her in Luna's seat already. The question carried more surprise than disrespect, but the tension in the room still sharpened immediately. Changho didn't even hesitate. She earned it. Silence followed. Amara felt the bond pulse faintly beneath her skin. Not aggressively. Steadily. Like Changho's certainty itself moved through it. The older wolf folded his hands carefully on the table. No one questions what happened at the compound, he said evenly. But some of the pack are struggling to understand what this means moving forward. Amara stayed quiet, listening carefully. Another wolf farther down the table finally spoke. Human mates are rare enough already. A human Luna with a fully active bond is something most of us have never seen. That doesn't make her weak, Han said immediately. The room shifted slightly at the firmness in his voice. Sable crossed her arms near the wall. Anyone who watched her stand beside Changho after that battle should already understand that. A few wolves nodded quietly. Others still looked uncertain. Amara glanced toward Changho briefly, before speaking for the first time. I know I'm not what any of you expected. The room settled immediately. She could feel the attention focusing more sharply now. But this time the pressure didn't make her shrink into herself the way it would have weeks ago. I don't fully understand the bond yet, she admitted honestly. Half the time I still feel like I'm learning an entirely different world overnight. Several wolves exchanged quieter looks after hearing that. Not dismissive. Listening. But I didn't come to Korea looking for power, Amara continued. I came here because I wanted a future for myself that I couldn't build back home. Her voice remained calm, even as emotion tightened slightly in her chest. And somewhere along the way, your alpha became part of that future. The bond warmed instantly beside her. Amara didn't need to look at Changho to feel his reaction. The older wolf near the end of the table studied her carefully for several seconds before finally speaking again. You stood beside him while he held Beihun beneath his claws. Amara met his gaze directly. Yes. Were you afraid of him? The question settled heavily into the room. Amara understood immediately why they were asking. Not because they doubted Changho. Because they needed to know whether their Luna trusted their alpha completely. Amara looked toward Changho then. At the man sitting beside her with healing wounds still visible beneath the collar of his shirt. The man who crossed rogue territory for her without hesitation. The man who held her through the night, afterward like letting go might destroy him. Then she looked back at the council. I was afraid for him, she answered quietly. The room went silent after that. Because every wolf there felt the truth in her words. One of the older women seated farther down the table finally smiled softly. Well, she said, glancing briefly toward Changho, that sounds like a Luna to me. A few quiet laughs broke some of the tension around the room. Even Han relaxed slightly. Changho's hand settled over Amara's beneath the table. The touch stayed calm, certain, proud, and for the first time since entering the council room, Amara stopped feeling like she needed to prove she belonged there. Because somewhere between the battle, the bond, and the wolves gathered around this table, she realized the pack had already started accepting her long before this meeting began.
Changho's POV. By the time Changho finally closed the bathroom door behind them, exhaustion had settled into his bones hard enough that even standing still hurt. Steam slowly filled the room as water poured into the oversized stone shower, fogging the mirrors and softening the harsh edges of the night they had just survived. The warmth should have relaxed him. Instead, he stood there staring at Amara in silence. At the bruises around her wrists, at the fading marks along her throat, at the exhaustion she was trying not to show, and beneath all of it, one thought kept repeating in his head. I almost lost her. Amara noticed the shift in his expression immediately. Without saying anything, she stepped closer and rested her hand gently against his chest. The contact grounded him instantly. You're doing it again, she said softly. Changho frowned slightly. Doing what? Looking at me like I disappeared already. The words landed harder than she probably intended. Changho lowered his eyes briefly before covering her hand with his. I can't help it yet. Amara's chest tightened, because she could feel the truth behind those words through the bond. Changho wasn't trying to be dramatic. The silence from the broken connection had affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit out loud. Her fingers moved carefully across one of the healing wounds near his ribs. You scared me too. Changho gave a quiet exhale before finally stepping past her toward the shower. Come here. The warm water hit his skin first, washing away dried blood in slow streams that disappeared down the drain almost immediately. Several cuts across his body had already begun healing, but others remained deep enough to ache every time he moved. A second later, Amara stepped beneath the water with him. The sight of her standing there wrapped in steam and soft light, after everything they survived, nearly stole the remaining air from his lungs. Changho reached for her instinctively. His hands settled against her waist before pulling her closer until her body pressed fully against his chest beneath the falling water. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer felt strained. It felt intimate. Necessary. Amara tilted her head back slightly to look up at him. "You're staring again." Changho's hands tightened slightly against her hips. "You're alive," he said quietly. "I'm still adjusting to that." The honesty in his voice made her expression soften immediately. Water slid slowly down her skin while Changho's eyes traced every visible bruise left behind by the kidnapping. Rage flickered through the bond again before he pushed it back down. Amara noticed anyway. Her hand slid slowly along his jaw. "I'm here." Changho closed his eyes briefly at the touch. The bond eased slightly around the edges. Without speaking, Amara reached for the soap resting near the wall and worked it slowly between her hands before stepping closer again. "Turn around." Changho actually looked surprised. Amara smiled faintly. "You're not the only one allowed to take care of somebody." A quiet laugh escaped him before he finally turned beneath the water. Amara's hands moved carefully across his back, cleaning away blood and dirt, while trying not to irritate the deeper wounds left by Varkos during the fight. Changho's head lowered slightly the longer her hands moved over him. Not from exhaustion. Trust. The realization affected Amara more than she expected. This man carried the weight of an entire pack on his shoulders every day. Wolves feared him, respected him, followed him without hesitation. But here, alone with her beneath the falling water, Changho allowed himself to soften in ways nobody else ever saw. "You know," Amara said quietly while rinsing blood from his shoulder, "my original plan for South Korea involved significantly less attempted murder." Changho laughed softly under his breath. "That disappointing, huh?" She stepped around him again slowly until they stood face to face beneath the water. "I haven't decided yet." The corner of his mouth lifted immediately. There she is. The thought moved through the bond so clearly that Amara felt it herself. Changho reached up slowly and brushed wet hair away from her face before his fingers traced lightly along the fading mark near her neck. The second he touched it, the bond warmed between them again. His expression darkened slightly. Not with anger. Memory. Need. Emotion still too fresh to fully bury. "You felt different after you called me," he admitted quietly. Amara looked up at him carefully. "Different how?" Changho's thumb brushed slowly across the mark again. "Stronger." The words settled between them quietly. Amara should have felt overwhelmed hearing it. Instead, something deeper inside her responded to it instinctively. Because she felt it too. Not power exactly. Presence. Confidence. Connection. As though the bond had finally stopped waiting for her to accept it. Changho leaned down slowly until his forehead rested against hers beneath the falling water. "You have no idea what you did to me in that compound," he whispered. Amara's arms wrapped around him immediately. "I think I'm starting to." The bond tightened warmly around both of them. And standing there beneath the water with Changho holding her against his chest, Amara realized something that should have terrified her far more than it did. For the first time in her life, she couldn't imagine a future that didn't include him in it. The compound felt quieter 3 days later. Not peaceful. There was still too much damage for that. Workers moved constantly through the grounds rebuilding barricades and repairing walls shattered during the attack. Patrol rotations had doubled since the battle, and every wolf in the pack remained alert for signs that Baehoon might attempt something reckless out of desperation. But underneath the tension, life had started moving again. And somehow, that felt stranger to Changho than the war did. He stood near the balcony outside his office, watching wolves cross the courtyard below, while evening rain rolled softly through the city beyond the compound walls. The injuries from the battle had mostly healed already. Only the deeper wounds across his ribs still pulled slightly when he moved too quickly. Physical healing was easy. The rest of it wasn't. Behind him, the office door opened quietly. Changho didn't need the bond to know it was Amara. He felt her the second she stepped onto the floor. "You disappeared after dinner." Her voice carried mild accusation beneath the softness. Changho turned toward her slowly. Amara crossed the office wearing one of his black hoodies and loose sweats, her dark hair still slightly damp from the shower she had taken earlier. The sight of her standing comfortably inside his space still affected him more than he wanted to admit. 3 days later, part of him still expected to wake up and realize the entire rescue had been grief-induced hallucination. Amara noticed the shift in his expression immediately. "You're doing that thing again." Changho exhaled quietly. "I don't know how to stop yet." The honesty made her chest tighten through the bond. She stepped closer until she stood directly in front of him. Then stop trying so hard. Changho looked down at her carefully. Amara's fingers slid into his hand naturally now, like the bond had already trained both of them to seek contact without thinking. You don't have to carry every emotion by yourself anymore, she said softly. The words hit harder than she realized, because that was exactly what he had spent most of his life doing. Changho's hand tightened gently around hers before he pulled her closer against him. Amara rested easily against his chest now. No hesitation. No uncertainty. The connection between them had settled into something deeper over the last few days, especially as the bond continued strengthening around her. She could already sense wolves moving through the compound without trying. Sometimes she reacted to emotions moving through the pack before anyone spoke them out loud. And every time it happened, Changho watched her carefully. Not fearful. Protective. Because the speed of her awakening still worried him more than he admitted openly. You're thinking too loud again, Amara murmured against his chest. A faint smile touched Changho's mouth. That's becoming annoying. I like annoying you. You enjoy dangerous hobbies. That earned a quiet laugh from her. The sound loosened something inside him immediately. For several seconds, they stayed wrapped around each other near the balcony, while rain drifted through the city beyond the compound. Then the bond shifted suddenly. Not painfully, sharply, like a thread pulling at Changho's instincts. His expression changed immediately. Amara felt it. What happened? Changho's eyes narrowed slightly toward the courtyard below. Han was crossing the compound quickly. Too quickly. A knock sounded against the office door seconds later. Come in. Han stepped inside immediately, rain still clinging to his jacket. His expression told Changho everything before he even spoke. We got confirmation from the Southern Territories. Changho's posture straightened slightly. Han looked briefly toward Amara before continuing. Beihun pulled what's left of his rogues completely out of the region. Amara blinked once. He's gone. Han nodded slowly. For now. Changho stayed silent. The bond between him and Amara tightened faintly as relief mixed with caution inside the room. Because they all understood the same thing. Beihun wasn't surrendering because he changed. He surrendered because he lost. He won't come back, Han continued. No rogue group wants another war after what happened at the compound. A quiet silence settled after that, and for the first time since the kidnapping, Changho finally felt the full weight of the truth settle into his chest. The war was over. Amara looked up at him carefully, emotion softening her face as she felt the realization move through the bond too. No more searching. No more running. No more waiting for the next attack. Just silence. And survival. Han glanced awkwardly between them before clearing his throat. Well, he said carefully, the university contacted us too. Amara frowned immediately. What? Han's mouth twitched slightly. Apparently your professors are becoming concerned about your attendance. Changho closed his eyes briefly. Amara stared at him. Then at Han. Then back at Changho. You mean to tell me I survived a kidnapping and almost started a supernatural war, and I still have assignments due? Han actually laughed. Changho's shoulders shook once beneath a quiet breath that almost sounded dangerously close to a real laugh too. And standing there between them, Amara realized something important. Life hadn't stopped. Not completely. The world she came to Korea for still existed outside the war, outside the bond, and outside the violence. And maybe that was a good thing. Changho looked down at her again, the heaviness in his expression finally easing slightly for the first time in days. We'll figure it out. Amara studied him for a second before smiling faintly. We. Changho's arm tightened around her waist. You think I'm letting you out of my sight long enough to fail graduate school? Amara laughed softly, and the sound warmed the bond instantly. Outside, rain continued falling across the compound, while wolves moved through the rebuilding grounds below. The war had ended. The pack survived. And for the first time since Amara arrived in South Korea, the future finally felt possible again.